Opioids are killing thousands of people every year in this country.
More than 49,000 Canadians have died from toxic opioids since 2016.
The warnings have been out there for several years. Why is this getting worse and not better?
The opioid crisis is the public health challenge of our time.
The absolute nightmare that they created is absolutely scandalous. It's tragic.
Who killed Canada? Over the past 10 years, more than 50,000 Canadians have died from drug-fueled chaos, overdoses, and violent attacks. A devastating reality that has left behind unimaginable suffering and more Canadian casualties than the Second World War. But how did we get here? And is there someone to blame? Did government policies to hand out free drugs make the problem worse? How about the decision to decriminalize fentanyl, meth, and crack cocaine? And were there some with ideological or financial motivations along the way that led to evidence being ignored, Canadians misled, and in some cases, outright lies?
This turns the government into a drug dealer with unlimited supply.
I wouldn't have spent another 2 years addicted to drugs if it was not so easy, Brett. I could get hundreds of pills at the beginning of the week.
When they call safe supply to a child, she assumed that they were safe, that one pill would be safe for her to take. My life went from somewhat normal to living hell.
My name is Aaron Gunn, and this is Politics Explained.
Vancouver police are looking for witnesses to what they're calling a completely unprovoked attack on a total stranger. In this security camera video from the scene, you can see a man sucker punch a 28-year-old man in the face, knocking him to the ground.
This attack comes just 1 week after another random assault on Yonge Street in the heart of downtown Toronto.
Wichican will not be testifying and explaining why he attacked a man he'd never met before. He was high on meth and roaming Royal University Hospital looking for drugs to steal.
An entire neighborhood overrun by drugs, with one product reigning supreme: fentanyl.
Opioid crisis continues to claim thousands of lives each year across Canada.
The grim figure remains stubbornly high, despite the government creating a ministry to tackle the crisis 6 years ago.
And today, the health minister admitted she has no idea when the situation will start to improve.
Who killed Canada? Open drug use, homeless encampments, random violent attacks. Once limited to areas like the downtown east side, all three are now commonplace in most Canadian cities, and it's reflected in the stats. Violent crime in Canada up 50% since 2015, 300,000 now estimated to be addicted to opioids and other hard drugs. While shocking drug-fueled stabbings and what are known as stranger attacks have rocked Vancouver, Toronto, and other major population centers. But it certainly isn't just our major cities that have seen a significant deterioration in public safety. Victoria, Nanaimo, Halifax, Ottawa, and, among the most notable, London, Ontario.
It's hard to just describe how bad things have gotten in London. I went to high school here, right downtown, and it was always a safe place to be. I could walk around the park. And most of the city now, I would say, certainly the downtown areas, have become unsafe, or at least people feel they're unsafe, whereas 10 years ago they wouldn't have. And I know people in this city that simply don't go out at night anymore, and certainly not alone.
On the streets in London in general, things have got more dangerous over the past 2 or 3 years. Have you noticed that at all?
Yeah, a lot dangerous. Just 2 days ago, I got stabbed in the arm.
You got stabbed in the arm just 2 days ago? 2
days ago, yeah, pretty bad.
Do you have an opinion on like why it's got more dangerous?
Lack of money, lack of it's just people need the drugs, right? People need to get their fix for the day, and they want to do whatever the hell they want to do, and they need to do to get that fix. And if that's or they're stealing or robbing people or beating people up, robbing them or whatever, right? So it's pretty freaking will tell you the truth.
You can't separate the drug issues from the crime issues. I mean, both of them are interconnected in tremendous ways, certainly with people dealing with addiction that need to get money to get their quick fix. What do? They steal something from your car. I had my GPS stolen, and who knows how much they got for it, enough to just get by on their addiction for the next couple of days. You have this tent city set up, another park not far from where we are now, Thames Park, now just overrun with what seems like a semi-permanent encampment.
The elderly couple has even had to deal with violence.
One of the guys living in the park attacked him with a knife. Yeah, because he has problem with hearing and they were demanding money and he didn't hear that. And when he got closer, he pulled the knife and started attacking him.
You go there and you will almost every single time witness some form of drug use there. It's absolutely, without fail, the thing that London has become known for, and it's become a ubiquitous part of the experience.
And when it comes to the explosion in drug addiction and correlation with criminal activity, in London, there is maybe no group more painfully aware of the reality than its police. And Nigel Stuckey, a recently retired 32-year veteran from the force, is certainly no exception.
Right now, there's open drug use like there's never been before. You can't walk downtown London without seeing evidences of drug use, right? There's either foils or people smoking fentanyl, and you can see people with needles in their arms sometimes. I ran into several people who are using what's known as like a ball a day of fentanyl, and that's 3.5 grams. So the street value of that is about $350 a day. If you multiply that for a year, I'm talking to people that are using from $60,000 to $115,000 a year to support their fentanyl habit. Well, where do you get that money? So I'll answer that. Some people commit crimes. So there is a connection between drug use and crime.
And while the increase in crime and social disorder caused by the addiction crisis certainly impacts the broader community, it still pales in comparison to the impacts on addicts themselves. In 2017, 34 Canadians died from opioid overdoses in London. In 2023, that number had climbed to 102, an increase of 200%, while countless others were revived by first responders and brought back from the dead.
My last 5 years of policing were frontline police supervision on the street. And the overdose after overdose after overdose. Like sometimes in downtown London, there's an overdose every hour that's taking place. And it got to the point where I noticed, even among emergency service providers, that there was a fatigue. Because you would have somebody who would overdose, you would revive them with Narcan, they would tell you they don't want to go to the hospital. They would go on their way, and later that day, you would revive them again.
And the overdose crisis is not limited to London, Ontario. Since 2016, when the Trudeau government first declared a public health emergency, more than 50,000 Canadians have died from drug overdoses here in Canada, representing tens of thousands of individual lives lost, an unprecedented crisis that has disproportionately affected young men and Indigenous communities, while leaving an untold number of families shattered and in disrepair. And nowhere has this crisis hit harder than in my home province of British Columbia.
Friday, at this tranquil beach on Vancouver Island, a sunrise swimmer found a tragedy unfolding. 4 people sprawled near a truck, overdosing. 2 women died, 2 men left in critical condition, all in their 30s and 40s. More than 6 people die every day on average in BC from toxic drugs.
In 2022, more than 2,400 British Columbians died from overdosing on drugs, a 793% increase since 2012, 32% of the Canadian total, despite having only 14% of Canada's population. In comparison, Quebec, which has 3 million more people than BC, had just 1/7 the number of overdose deaths. And to those that live in British Columbia, the deterioration on the streets has been only too clear for those to see, as first responders and hospitals have been overwhelmed with the surge in what has become a drug-fueled mess. Faced with an obvious crisis, both the Liberal government in Ottawa and NDP government in BC came under pressure to act. But rather than attempting to curtail the widespread availability of illicit drugs or investing heavily in treatment and recovery, the two governments decided to go in a decidedly different direction.
The effects of this public health crisis have devastated communities across British Columbia and across Canada. We are working in tandem to try and save lives.
BC taking new steps to fight the overdose crisis. The province asking the federal government to decriminalize the possession of small amounts of illicit drugs.
Adults 18 and over in British Columbia will no longer be subject to criminal charges for the possession of up to 2.5 grams of certain illegal drugs for personal use, and the drugs will not be confiscated.
In a dramatic move, the federal Liberal government, in coordination with the BC NDP, decriminalized the possession of up to 2.5 grams of cocaine, crack, crystal meth heroin, and even fentanyl, arguing at the time that the move was necessary to reduce the stigma of using these substances and to normalize drug use in public. The results were not exactly hard to predict, as pointed out by RCMP veteran and Surrey MLA, Eleanor Sturko.
I think that we did see an emboldening here of some behaviors. You know, there was countless, anyone can go on the social media or the internet and find videos of people openly using drugs on our public transit, in public places, restaurants. You know, people were sending me photos from their local Tim Hortons with people, cutting lines of some substance on the tables where, the next customer could be a mom and a kid.
A man smoking what appears to be illicit drugs inside a Maple Ridge Tim Hortons. In the video, through the drug smoke, you can see two patrons in the booth behind.
You could be sitting behind them and breathe it in. I don't know, I think it's dangerous.
No way it should be inside of a restaurant, especially at Tim Hortons where there's children, there's families.
And the reality being that it wasn't illegal to possess those drugs. And so, there's very little that the police could do. And in fact, you were at the beach, you call in that someone's smoking crack next to your family, the police would be powerless because drug use itself isn't illegal. It's the possession of the drugs. But under decriminalization, it was not illegal for people to possess and use drugs in public places.
All it did was embolden drug users to now use it in cafes and hospital beds and, and to say, no, this is illegal, this is my right,
And so their approach was very Orwellian. Ignore the evidence of your eyes and ears, right? You're not seeing what you're seeing. But I saw it with my own two eyes. I heard stories from people in our community who were running into it, and our bylaw officers, they were reporting increased public drug use. And so I started communicating right away to the province that this is a problem.
And the effects of decriminalization weren't just felt in Vancouver and its surrounding municipalities, as cities of all sizes were suddenly forced to confront an explosion in public drug use with no means to fight back. A reality that drew the ear of some local leaders, most prominently in my home of Campbell River, where the mayor, most city councillors, and the popular chief of the Weewakai First Nation began speaking out.
Ever since decriminalization came through is when the door is really opened for drug use. Because before you couldn't see any of it, right? But now it's with it being legal, you can do it anywhere you want. And to me, that was very alarming. To be honest, I don't think I've ever thought it would be this bad. Growing up, you barely ever saw anything. I always used to look at myself and say to my kids, we're gonna go to Vancouver and we're gonna go down to East Van because I want to show you something that you most likely will never see at home. And all of a sudden now it's to the point where I can just drive downtown and it's the same view. I've never seen so much drug use in the last 10 years, or let alone in my life of living in Campbell River.
We came here in late 1985, and back then there was nothing like this. Yep. In the 80s, people still hid in alleys to smoke weed. So it's dramatically different. There was nothing that they could do. They couldn't arrest someone for doing drugs in playgrounds. They couldn't take anyone's drugs away from them anymore.
What was your kind of gut reaction to that policy proposal?
To be honest, shocked. I was just we're doing what? I was lost for words when the RCMP came in for a local meeting, just for our council meeting, and they explained this was happening, and we were just like, this can't be true.
Shortly after decriminalization was introduced, the city of Campbell River, with the full support of Chief Chakite, became the first city in the province to introduce a bylaw restricting open-air drug use within the municipality. A move that drew immediate legal challenges and backlash from the province, but, after some alterations, would not only succeed, but be emulated by others, including by the outspoken and popular mayor of Port Coquitlam, Brad West.
So we were very strong right out of the gate on this in saying that this is not acceptable and we're not going to stand by and allow it to happen. Port Coquitlam was one of the first cities, well, the first in the Lower Mainland, but one of the first in the province to pass a bylaw saying there is no public drug use in this community.
So yeah, it was crazy to us that they didn't put any safeguards in place at all. And then when we tried to put some in, there was, it seems like significant blowback, but that's just because that's what the mainstream media wants you to think. You know, I got way more emails telling me that that was a good thing, that the community was super supportive of what we were doing. You know, I still hear about it on a daily basis, that community members are happy that we were the first ones, even if it made us look bad in the media. We were doing what was right.
In the months that followed, opposition to decrim began to grow, and under mounting public pressure, the BC NDP and Liberal government in Ottawa finally conceded, announcing a partial repeal of the decriminalization of hard drugs only months after it was enthusiastically introduced. But many of the consequences of this radical social experiment remain to this day.
The genie is still out of the bottle. It's hard to unring a bell. When you do something like that, it's not just a quick reverse course. So I think communities across British Columbia are still dealing with the impact of it.
But while drug-fueled chaos and death has spread to nearly every corner of BC, there is still no place quite like Vancouver's downtown east side. A dystopian alternate reality that some might be surprised to know was actually created on purpose by government. A fact explained to me by the former mayor of Vancouver, Sam Sullivan.
The strategy was all wrong, and it was driven, let's say, by Marxists and people who are very counterculture. And we're going to make this paradise here. It's called the Downtown East Side. The city created it. It's named it. We got a government grant to do it. And let's create our paradise. The people thought they could put all these people in one place and then isolate it from the rest of the population. No, what happened was it just got exponentially worse. It is way worse than it was in the 1990s. The dystopia, the absolute nightmare that they created is absolutely scandalous. It's tragic. The problems of the downtown east side in the 1990s were terrible. People were overdosing. We're getting up to 100 people a year dying.
Just to go into details to contrast those numbers that you just said, was in the early 2000s, late 90s, was the idea of 100 people dying in British Columbia from overdoses considered a big number at that time?
We declared a health emergency. And now the downtown east side is everywhere. Throughout the whole province of BC, every small town even has a downtown east side. That it was a catastrophic failure of government action.
The downtown east side is maybe the most visible failure of government policy in recent Canadian history, and the breeding ground for what's known as harm reduction, a set of government policies that aims to reduce the harms caused by illicit drug use without actually requiring individuals to stop using drugs themselves. This can include needle exchanges, injection sites, and other increasingly brazen proposals, one of which recently appeared outside the Nanaimo, Victoria, and Campbell River hospitals.
I heard about it first from one of the staff that worked there that sent me a picture of something under construction. No, I didn't know anything about it. I'm a member of the regional hospital board, and I didn't remember it being discussed at the board table. So I get this picture of some random woodworking project, and started checking into it and found out that it was going to be a kiosk for all this drug paraphernalia right at the doors for Emerge. And why would you be doing that at the hospital? Why are people at the hospital being encouraged to smoke crack or, snort lines of cocaine? Doesn't it sound like proper hospital activity to me? And our government thought that it should be acceptable.
Fraser Health, which is the region that I live in, they had established a website that would allow for medical delivery service, would deliver you crack pipes and snorting kits and whatever you want. And it even had videos of how to safely smoke crystal meth, little videos on how to load the bowl. And it's just so, I just think to myself, like, how far have we fallen as a country from one that would hide cigarettes behind a curtain to becoming a country that would deliver a crack pipe to your door or give you a crack pipe in a vending machine.
What is the government doing? How did we get here? And how did we lose our way? To find out, I met with Adam Zivo, a Canadian investigative journalist at the forefront of Canada's drug policy debate.
Since the 90s, there's been this popular 4 pillars approach to treating addiction: prevention, harm reduction, treatments, and law enforcement. And all 4 of them are a necessary part to a holistic drug strategy. That being said, over the past 20 years in Canada, and especially in BC, we have privileged harm reduction so dramatically that we have forgotten the other 3 pillars. We've forgotten that prevention matters, that we need to focus on treating people, and that law enforcement is necessary. There are many forms of harm reduction that can be useful. It's just that the way that we are doing harm reduction right now is not productive.
I have seen over the last decade harm reduction efforts ramp up significantly in this city. This has all taken place while the drug problem in the city has gotten worse and worse and worse. So clearly it's not working, and you don't need to look at numbers. You can look around, but the numbers show what everyone sees when they're looking around too.
Harm reduction is misunderstood. Everybody thinks it's harm reduction for the drug addicted person. It's actually harm reduction for the community also. Everyone has to have their harms reduced if you want this thing to work.
It's clear that something has gone terribly wrong in our strategy to address the addictions crisis. But what part of harm reduction are we clearly not getting right? I asked that question to Dr. Keith Humphreys, a globally renowned expert in addictions and professor at Stanford University.
There's been a change in, I think, how people think about harm reduction. So, there was a generation of public health people would have said, look, drugs are damaging to health, but they are a health matter, and we should try to keep people alive and give them treatment to help them stop. More now, it's moved more to drug use is an inalienable right that no one should, that the state should not infringe in any way, and no one should look down on, and it is really no different a lifestyle choice than not using drugs.
And the caveat was always that harm reduction was a tool to keep people stable, bring them into the system, and then get them into treatment, because the expectation was that drugs were not and could not and should not be a part of your life long term. That's not the discussion that's taking place now. And I actually spoke years ago to someone who worked for one of the harm reduction programs who used to say, well, we all have vices, so who am I to judge that this person's vice being hard drugs is less bad than me smoking cigarettes, say. That was what this woman said. And now getting people off of drugs is simply not part of the discussion. There's been a huge bait and switch that's all taken place under the guise of so-called harm reduction. We are giving up on people when we say that you can continue and you should continue using drugs. We'll just try to fix these little extraneous things around it to make it so that you're less likely to overdose, but you're still going to be hooked on drugs for the rest of your life.
I think the overemphasis of harm reduction and the sole focus on that and the extremism of that is very harmful to the addicts themselves and to the neighboring community. That it's all very, making sure there's no stigma.
should we destigmatize? Should we even try to destigmatize fentanyl use? I would say no. We want to destigmatize for sure addiction. We want to absolutely destigmatize seeking help. But fentanyl use is an incredibly dangerous thing to do, and we use stigma in society to discourage people from doing things that we think are wrong or we think are dangerous. We stigmatize tobacco smoking far more than we ever did. We stigmatize drunk driving far more than we ever did. Those guardrails help a lot of people not even entertain the decision of, do I want to do that? It's just, well, that's something we just don't do. And that's important. We need that for fentanyl, we need that for methamphetamine, because they're just incredibly dangerous drugs.
In the government's ideological crusade against destigmatizing hard drugs, rather than reflecting on a near decade of failed policies, they decided to double down and instead pursue their most radical policy yet.
One of the things that we have done that turned around from the previous government was invest a lot more in safe supply, in making sure that there's access to safe supply so that people can be supported.
People are dying because of the toxic, tainted drug supply. When people are on safe supply, less drug use, less overdoses.
And when it comes to how we respond to an unprecedented public health emergency, this is a time for us all to come together and listen to what our health experts are telling us, listen to what the health professions are telling us their patients need.
What's it going to take to turn this around?
The distribution of safer supply is imperative to reduce the death.
Safe supply, a buzz phrase used by politicians and pro-drug activists to market an idea at the extreme end of the harm reduction spectrum, and the theory behind it is relatively straightforward to understand. Fentanyl is killing thousands of Canadians every year, but what if the government provided these same addicts with a slightly less powerful pharmaceutical-grade opioid instead? One that could get you high, but with less chance of a fatal overdose. On a certain level, it makes logical sense. A government-provided safe supply could displace illicit fentanyl in the black market, saving lives and bankrupting organized crime along the way. But if that's the theory of safe supply, how does it work in practice? Has it actually reduced harm as the Liberals and NDP have claimed? Or has it been a failed experiment from the very start?
Safer Supply was first piloted in London, Ontario in 2016. It was proposed by a doctor named Andrea Sarita, and she initially pitched this as a way to keep vulnerable sex workers safe. The idea is that if you provided them with the addictive drugs that they wanted, or rather a pharmaceutical alternative to them, that they would have less reason to sell their bodies on the streets. The scope of the project was very quickly expanded to include all kinds of drug users, with this idea that if you provided pharmaceutical alternatives to drug users of any type, that would reduce any kind of overdose or death. The BC Centre on Substance Use, which is a highly influential organization that specializes in addiction policy in BC, wrote a set of clinical guidelines which essentially enabled doctors all across the province, and to some extent Canada as well, to prescribe safer supply.
Since its introduction in London in 2016, Safe Supply has expanded dramatically, particularly across Ontario and BC. But what exactly are the drugs handed out by the Safe Supply program? How powerful are they? And are they as safe as the government claims? To find out, I met with Dr. Michael Lester, a physician who specializes in addiction medicine in Toronto.
What's, just to give people who don't know, which is most people, this Safe Supply program, what does it involve? What are the drugs that they're handing out, and how powerful or addictive or safe are those drugs?
They're handing out Dilaudid, which is the trade name for hydromorphone. It's a very powerful opioid. There were actually studies in Canada where they gave people who didn't know what they were getting a bolus of heroin and a bolus of hydromorphone, and they could not tell them apart. As doses go, a common amount that's given for Safe Supply is 8 milligrams tablets, 25 a day. It's hundreds of milligrams of hydromorphone.
Is that a lot?
To put it in perspective, someone suffering with cancer pain would probably start on 3 milligrams a day.
And we're giving people hundreds
a day.
First, I didn't believe it. It was like, a patient told me about it, and I said, no. And he's like, yeah, they're giving free hydromorphone tablets to take home. So we called, and they were giving out free hydromorphone tablets, and then I spoke to some addiction physicians, I spoke to the physicians in the office, and it's like, this is insane.
Dilaudid is a very powerful opioid, not as strong as fentanyl, but certainly very potent. It's Schedule II in the United States, so that's where we put things that have some medical uses, but have significant risk, and so need to be tightly controlled.
It is highly addictive. So if you've been using it regularly for a few days, your chance of developing a dependency is quite high. It is not safe. You can overdose from Dilaudid, but you can also transition into using something stronger.
I mean, hydromorphone is basically heroin, so it is as addictive as heroin. Try it once, try it twice, soon you'll be using it again and again and again, and 1 pill a day will become 2 pills a day, will become 3 pills, 5 pills, 10 pills, 20 pills, and eventually it won't be enough for you, and then you escalate onto fentanyl, which then sometimes kills you. That's how all of this works.
Dilaudid is the brand name of the drug hydromorphone, an opioid 5 to 7 times more potent than morphine and comparable to that of heroin, and just as addictive. But putting aside the potential dangers of hydromorphone itself, if it is used by opioid addicts as a substitute for fentanyl, perhaps it's still, on the whole, saving lives. To find out, I traveled to Ottawa to meet with Dimitri, a young man struggling with addiction, including to fentanyl and crack cocaine, who has recently begun receiving safe supply.
The drug use started at like 14, 15.
And then how did it progress from that point pretty quick into opioids, or was that a...
No, actually, the opiates started when I was getting dental work done. And I got prescribed some oxycodone, 5 milligrams. So, and when I took them, I noticed that it didn't just take away the physical pain, but also like my emotional pain. And then from there, it quickly progressed, I guess, to me trying to find dealers that sold, Percocets and oxys at higher milligram levels. And, you're like, screw it. If you're, depressed enough and an addict enough, you'll seek out, fentanyl or heroin. I had a very high tolerance to opiates, so I thought I did. And then when I did my first line of fentanyl, it was like, a tiny little line like this long, because I know how dangerous it is, right? And just that tiny little bit, I almost felt sick to my stomach. I instantly started nodding out of consciousness. It was way more intense than any opiate. And at that time I had a good tolerance to opiates, so that's how strong it was.
And did it automatically hook you? Like after that, you just didn't who cares about the Percocets or anything? Just
yeah, for sure. Yeah, because then also I was aware that it kind of ruined all other opiates.
Dimitri's mother, Masha, who also lost her daughter after a long and painful battle with addiction, has been trying everything she can to save the life of her only son, including giving him a place to stay and countless opportunities of support.
My son overdosed a month before she did, but he lived just because of circumstance where the first responders were there. That was in August of 2020. So we brought him back. I arranged for mental health counseling. I arranged for private rehab. And then my son ended up at the clinic on Rideau Street.
Desperate to save her son from his battle with addiction, Masha took him to Recovery Care, advertised as an addiction treatment clinic with multiple locations in Ontario. To her surprise, rather than getting him off drugs, they supplemented his current supply.
I didn't really ask for safe supply, which I don't know why. I guess because I was still doing so much fentanyl that I didn't care for Dilaudid. But then one day they were like, do you think having Dilaudid would help your addiction? I was like, I I don't know, I just really care about fentanyl, but I guess I'll give it a shot. Honestly, I was so depressed and did not care at all about living or dying, anything. So for me, for a while, all it did was make my tolerance even higher. You know, there was a point where I'd get 28 a day, I'd take all 28 at once, and then smoke fentanyl. I was kind of wild.
On the Safe Supply program, Dimitri was given 28 hydromorphone tablets a day, but even this wasn't enough to stop him from using fentanyl. Instead, the Dilaudid only added to his daily intake of drugs, although there were occasions that Masha would observe where he didn't consume all of his pills.
Well, I started paying attention, I guess, last year maybe, even before. And there was a couple of times where I noticed that he had leftovers, and I said, what are you doing with those? Well, I didn't take them all.
For the most part, I used all of them myself. As I said, I would take the whole bottle at once, but there was the odd time where if I was struggling, I would give a very small amount to trade for fentanyl. I used to see it happen right outside the clinic all the time. Literally, someone walks out with their prescription and takes a few footsteps, and boom, they trade the whole bottle and then in exchange get a certain amount of fentanyl.
But I've actually seen the transfer of the little pills into the dealer's hand and an exchange. I've seen that.
For money or other drugs?
Other drugs. I've never seen an exchange of money. I've just seen I see the pills being counted, and then they go around the corner and they start smoking. So obviously they got something.
Masha's son was trading at least some of his Safe Supply pills for fentanyl, and Masha herself witnessed many others doing the same. But why? Why would somebody continue using fentanyl when provided with lower risk pharmaceutical grade opioids for free? And how widespread had reselling these drugs become? While still in Ottawa, I sat down with David, an outreach worker who supports addicts in his community and a former heroin addict himself, now in recovery.
90% of the people who are getting Safe Supply are diverting some of their supply.
90% of the people
who are getting on Safe Supply
yeah.
are diverting some of their Safe Supply every day.
Reselling it.
Reselling it. But the people who are getting 30 a day, they have them pre-sold to a fentanyl seller. So they'll go to the fentanyl seller and say, I'll give you my 30 Dilaudid, I'd rather have 0.2 of fentanyl.
How long have you been on the program for?
About 4 months.
About 4 months?
Mm-hmm.
And so how many do you get a day?
I get 20.
You get 20, eh?
Mm-hmm. Most people that I know personally, they're not stopping. They're just trading their stuff in for like the Fetty and selling your drugs to get the fucking fentanyl anyways. But yeah, it's making it kind of worse really, not really helping at all.
It's not helping nobody, I'll tell you the truth at all, huh? I know that for a fact because I know everyone that does it, right? So everyone has them. Everyone has them. They're supposed to be helping people, but people that are taking them, they're just selling them for more fentanyl.
I had a patient came back from one of the programs about 3-4 months ago, and I said to him, of all the people you met in the program, was there anyone that wasn't selling some or all of the pills they were getting? And he said, not a single person. But the reality is that people don't even want it, because if they're giving it to people who are taking fentanyl, hydromorphone is not as powerful as fentanyl. It's a strong, strong opiate, but it's not as strong as fentanyl. So if you have someone who likes using fentanyl, and you give them something they can sell to buy more fentanyl, what they're going to do is take it and sell it and buy more fentanyl.
Fentanyl gives a better high than Dilaudid. So if someone is physically dependent on fentanyl and they're used to the high of fentanyl, they're not going to want to go for the second-rate high of Dilaudid. They'll just easily market the Dilaudid, get the funds to buy fentanyl, and carry on. If anything, using more fentanyl, because now they've got the funds to buy it, where before they didn't.
I can't even believe it's a thing. There are people who get upwards of nearly 70 Dilaudids a day, every day.
70?
And we all know nobody's what? And then It's just a currency to help to get, I'm just like, I'm collecting empties to get your cash to get, it's a currency, it's it.
It is pretty much a form of currency, and you don't need cash. And a lot of people will take Dilaudid for anything, not just fentanyl,
It's putting drugs on the street. It's giving all these addicts access to a currency to actually get street drugs. The very street drug Safe Supply is supposed to prevent. And then the market is being flooded with all these hydromorphins. They call them dillies. The street value right now in Ottawa is about $2 a dilly.
One of the quickest ways to illustrate that this is a problem is to look at street prices of these drugs, because the price of a commodity is very much reflective of its supply and demand. And the price of an 8 milligram hydromorphone pill has collapsed by over 90%.
Dilaudid, 8 milligrams, or hydromorphone, 8 milligrams, it was available back in my day for $40 to $50 a pill. It is now $2 a pill. $2.
By mass prescribing an opioid like Dilaudid that is then diverted or resold to the black market, the government has quite literally flooded our streets with drugs. So much so that the price of the drug in question, hydromorphone, has totally collapsed, making it even more accessible and attainable to would-be drug users. But if a majority of those in the program are in fact selling or diverting their safe supply, where does it all end up? Who is purchasing these dillies, and could we be creating the next generation of addicts? Back in London, I met with Calum, a young man who burned through his life savings after developing an addiction to OxyContin. Out of money, he considered seeking treatment. That's when he heard of Safe Supply.
Before you kind of discovered the Safe Supply, would you consider yourself of having an opioid addiction at that point?
Yes, I knew at that point that I had it, and I already wanted to stop. At the end of my road, I had no money left, right? It was a struggle, but I had met a guy who had been homeless. He told me, hey man, I just started living in this new housing for the homeless, and I'm the first person in my building, but there's a couple people that are coming here that I know and I've met. They're on this new program, it's called Safe Supply, and it's really, they're getting a lot of pills and for very cheap. And I'm like, really? He's like, yeah, they don't pay for them, so they don't care what price you pay them. And I was like, there's no way, that makes no sense. He's like, dude, the government gives it to them, they get it through these clinics, and then, they can do whatever they want with it afterwards. They need to buy fentanyl or crack or meth, which are all cheap. So, if you give them like, $100 to $150 and you're getting 80 pills, they'll give it to you right away.
And that's significantly a multitude cheaper than what you were paying for them before.
I was only able to afford like 10 perks a day if I was doing oxys, like 1 or 2, right? Once the Safe Supply drugs are so available, I was able to get 100 pills a week on the same budget.
I mean, the people pushing these policies, I think, self-identify as harm reduction activists.
Yeah.
But from your personal experience with this drug, do you feel like by flooding the streets with hydromorphone, they're actually creating more harm?
Yes, they are creating more harm. If I was never able to get that many pills that cheap, I would have already been through rehab. I probably would have never seen some of the terrible things that I've seen,
I don't think the general public really understands what's happening. I don't know that they understand that it's taxpayer dollars funding people who have a substance use disorder issue, but it's providing them with the drugs tax-free, and oftentimes it's not enough for them, right? This is what we're hearing, and they're being sold so that they can purchase fentanyl and other things, which is putting these safer drugs on the street that other people might think are safe and don't realize the problems that are down the road for them, especially young people.
She would start dabbling in pot, and I was like, okay. I'm not a big fan of this, Camilla. But at the time, it's like, okay, most of us at that age had experience with pot, so I was like, it's not the worst thing ever. And after that, she wanted stronger stuff, stronger to meet her highs. And that's when she first started to do the dillies.
And how old is she at this point when the...
13.
13.
I could notice her behavior changing, more defiant, and my life went from somewhat normal to living hell. I'd have to go out at night searching for her, try to find her. Her and her friends would be doing it together in their bedrooms. And when she came out, she was a zombie. And I'd be like, okay, what are you doing? I'm just on pot, Dad. I was like, no, that's not pot. What are you on?
Do you think, was it used just here and there? Or do you think it was an addiction at that point?
No, it became an addiction. They needed to sleep. They developed anxiety because they were isolated during COVID. And that's when they started to do the dillies to feel comfortable. It wasn't until they overdosed on it and ended up in the hospital again, my daughter and her best friend at the same time. She was pretty much dead in a park.
After Camilla's overdose, Greg was understandably desperate for help. He turned to the government of BC, but found nothing that they or he could do to save his daughter's life.
They admitted her and they were bringing a psychiatrist to see her, so I was like, okay. I walked into the room, psychiatrist came in, he looks at my daughter, do you want your father in here? No, I don't. Grab a coffee, came back up, she'd already been discharged. And I asked the psychiatrist, what did he find out? Oh, in my opinion, she's in good health. There's nothing wrong with her. You ask and beg for help and it's always a closed door. She has to ask herself. I'm not allowed to have the records or be in the room to hear what's going on. And it was frustrating. It was like watching my daughter commit suicide for a year.
Sword says he desperately wanted to help his daughter, but was told she needed to consent to treatment. Greg Sword agonizing over the death of his 14-year-old daughter, Camilla.
I'll never see her graduate. Never get to walk her down the aisle. It just shattered my world. And I have a giant hole in my heart that I have to try to mend and recover. I didn't know what hydromorphine was until after she died. I never heard of the term, no idea what the drug was. Until the coroner called me and told me they found three narcotics in her system: MDMA, cocaine, and hydromorphone. And I was like, okay, MDMA and cocaine, okay, what's this hydromorphone? So I went and started talking to her friends. And that's when it blew my mind what was really going on, because they're like, oh no, we get on the SkyTrain, head to East Vancouver, get off the SkyTrain by the waves, walk down. They would either, most people would either offer us dillies, or we just had to walk up to one, ask them for a dilly. They'd walk into the pharmacy, grab it, come back out and sell it to us. And I sat there and watched my daughter's friends struggle after she passed away, and they were still doing it because they couldn't cope. One of them turned to heroin. It is disgusting what their solution for addiction of an opioid crisis is by introducing more opioids to society. This is a true introductory drug to the opioids, because at a certain point, the hydromorphine is not going to be strong enough. And I know this because my daughter's friends went from the hydromorphone, people went to heroin just to get to the next high. And then what's next? The fentanyl.
Do you ever wonder, do you think that your daughter might still be alive today if the government didn't start this program?
Yes. Yeah, because they made drugs, these strong drugs, so easy for kids to get.
Mm-hmm.
What I have seen is that people who had never used opioids previously have started using Dilaudid from this program. And particularly vulnerable are youth.
It's a no-brainer that the more available a drug is in the community, the more likely it's going to be tried, experimented with. When you distribute hydromorphone in large amounts into any community, it's going to find its way in all different places. You know, the teenagers have a nickname for dilaudid. They call them dillies. Why would they possibly have a nickname for them if they weren't available to them?
It's become a starter drug because you're exposing people to powerful opiates in the absence of them immediately overdosing and dying, but it starts that road to addiction.
And it doesn't help that they're marketing it as safe supply for some of these new users.
It hurts. So I said it would be better to call it unsafe supply because I can't imagine what part of it is safe.
Rather than displacing fentanyl as the opioid of choice, the government's safe supply program simply made the crisis worse, flooding the market with deadly and addictive drugs that created new addicts while disincentivizing others to finally get clean. But as the results of this devastating social experiment began to roll in, how did the government react? Did they acknowledge the harm their policies had begun to create? Or did they look for ways to deny, mislead, and cover up their tracks?
RCMP are clarifying there is no evidence to suggest a widespread diversion of safer supply drugs into the illegal market.
We know organized crime is engaged in the drug trade. What I can also tell you is from the commanding officer of the RCMP in the province of British Columbia that there is no evidence of widespread diversion from the safe supply.
Suddenly, you have the BC RCMP saying diversion is not an issue, and then simultaneously issuing what appears to be a gag order to all of the lower level detachments so they can't freely talk about potential diversion. They said, you know, we have to be mindful of the fact that it's an election year. There's an election coming up. I think that raised a lot of red flags.
I was really furious when the first busts started happening.
In a series of busts over the last 3 months, Mounties have uncovered thousands of prescription pills, mostly opioids, including dilaudid.
This very idea that we would have such a big seizure and that this is the only one that ever happened, right?
The seizures in Prince George, not an isolated event. Days later, news of another bust announced, this time in Campbell River, where 3,500 dilaudid pills were seized.
I was surprised by the size of it. Not that it happened. We had been trying to talk to everyone we could about the fact that it was happening and that, you know, these dillies were getting sold to young people. Nobody wanted to listen.
You're not expecting a small community like ours. You know, there's the 3,500 dilaudid pills was definitely alarming because, I mean, those can get in the hands of anybody. Like I have a 16-year-old daughter, and she was telling about the stuff that goes through the school, and I'm just like, what? Like, I just never thought we would see that.
Throughout these busts, the government maintained a consistent position that diversion was not a significant problem. But their story started to crack when the London police finally blew the whistle, admitting to the public what many others already knew.
The diversion of safe supply is occurring in this community. It's being trafficked into other communities, and it is being used as currency in exchange for fentanyl, fueling the drug trade.
In London, Ontario, they've had safer supply since 2016. However, access to the program was dramatically expanded in 2020. So in 2019, according to London police, they seized about 850 hydromorphone pills. By 2023, they seized 30,000. 30,000 pills. That is a 3,000% increase. And to give you context for what that means, just 3 of these pills is enough to induce an overdose if snorted with an opioid-naive user like a teenager. So these 30,000 pills, that's the equivalent of 10,000 overdoses.
But what's really important to note is when you see that number of dilaudids associated with weapons, and so in that instance a handgun, these are weapons that are with overcapacity magazines that are associated with organized crime. The link between what's being distributed from a doctor to what's entering into the hands of organized crime has been made. And it's my belief that as soon as you have that link, you can no longer say that this is harm reduction. You've lost that right. because it's within the business plan of organized crime to get more people addicted to opioids.
The Safe Supply program in London is really just government subsidizing the illegal drug trade, and it's not putting safe drugs in people's systems. It's letting them finance their addictions to the dangerous stuff that we were trying to get them off of in the first place.
London police officers, with London taxpayer money, are removing opioids from the street that have been provided by the Canadian government.
They've been put there by
and
the
if that's not madness, I can't tell you what madness is.
We became the dealers, and that's the most frustrating thing is how do you go after the biggest drug dealer in society when it's your own government?
By flooding the market with free, addictive opioids, the Liberal government in Ottawa and NDP in BC were in essence bankrolling organized crime. And it is perhaps for this reason, more than any other, that they were so hesitant to admit diversion was happening. But no cover-up can last forever. And when an internal BC government memo was leaked, which revealed that they had known widespread diversion had been occurring for years, the jig was up.
Why do you think it was taking them so long to acknowledge something that was so obviously happening right in front of their eyes? Is it willful blindness? Is it?
Oh no, there can't be any blindness. The people who were denying or minimizing are also some of the people who had published that diversion was occurring. If somebody is on record saying that diversion occurs, and then later, after a much larger volume of pharmaceuticals is inserted into the population, they say, oh no, it's not really occurring, or it's not occurring very much, that's not really blindness, it's lying.
They knew that diversion was happening, but I think that they believed that diversion was a good thing. There was this report, I guess you could call it, or guidance document that was done. It was called Reframing Diversion. And it was done by the Safe Supply Community Practice, and they had a SUOP grant from the federal government, and they made this document, and it's basically to give to doctors to tell them that diversion is actually not a bad thing. You know, I think that at some point there was this belief that if you would just divert enough pills, you would supplant the criminal market and you'd get rid of all the poison and it would just be dillies everywhere and everyone would do dillies.
It's a travesty. They didn't monitor it. They closed their eyes. They had to know what was going on. We knew what was going on immediately. I think the fear is that, on their part, is they can't say, we spent $100 million tax dollars and it was a big mistake and we've increased the supply of opiates on the streets.
But regardless of what exactly the provincial government knew or when they knew it, the consequences of dramatically increasing the supply of opioids in society while falsely labeling them as safe was already well documented and well understood, especially considering just 15 years earlier, a certain pharmaceutical company, driven by profits and greed, was prosecuted for doing the exact same thing.
Once you've found the right doctor and have told him or her about your pain, don't be afraid to take what they give you. Often, it will be an opioid medication. Some patients may be afraid of taking opioids because they're perceived as too strong or addictive. But that is far from actual fact.
There are very strong parallels between the safer supply diversion scandal and the OxyContin crisis of the late 90s and 2000s.
We had, over a period of about 10 or 15 years, a fourfold per capita increase in opioid prescribing, both in Canada and the United States. Those opioids were legally made, they were of consistent quality, they were clearly labeled, and they killed lots and lots of people.
During the OxyContin crisis, some unscrupulous doctors operated clinics known as pill mills. They would prescribe these safe pharmaceutical opioids to anyone who would ask for them, more or less. The barriers were so low that they were a joke. And by all accounts, it was incredibly obvious that the people who were seeking these drugs were addicted to them. They were not genuine pain patients. And the pill mills that operated in those days would distribute huge sums of these opioids. And then these opioids would be diverted onto the streets.
The crisis was largely about overprescribing and diversion. So we saw a huge number of people get addicted and a huge number of people that weren't prescribed taking the drugs and suffering the consequences of that.
And so what you have here is a clinic which is giving drug addicts free pharmaceutical opioids. just like what we're seeing with safer supply today. And we know what happens with that. We know that this leads to disaster. We know that this leads to mass diversion. We saw all of this during the OxyContin crisis.
It wasn't even that long ago.
No, this was just over 10 years ago. Right, this is insane. How do we forget all of this? We are suing Purdue Pharma for the disastrous impact of the OxyContin crisis. And at the very same time, we are championing this experiment, which is essentially OxyContin 2.0.
Even more shocking, the drug the government is currently prescribing for safe supply, Dilaudid, is trademarked and manufactured by the exact same company they are currently suing in court, Purdue Pharma. This all makes no sense. And yet, there are those within the Liberal government in Ottawa and the NDP government in BC who think we haven't gone far enough.
Dr. Bonnie Henry, who is the top doctor in BC, recently released a report calling for non-medical safer supply, which is obscene. It's completely obscene. She was essentially arguing that requiring a prescription for safer supply medications is inappropriate. It creates too many barriers.
And it recommends this whole prescriber-free compassion club model, in addition to a model where drugs like crystal meth, heroin, cocaine potentially be sold in retail settings. And in order to, sort of bolster the argument for compassion clubs, here we have her citing the research done at Dolph.
The Drug User Liberation Front has spent a month running a compassion club, selling tested drugs to members. The club has been selling unadulterated cocaine, heroin, and meth.
We do have funding from our local health authority because the problem in Vancouver is very, very severe.
But we can't use any of that money to buy drugs.
Right. We can't use their money to buy drugs. There's a lot of laundry.
The group, commonly known as Dolph, has operated in the community for 3 years, distributing drugs allegedly bought from the dark web.
To me, I was really disturbed to see that. This was criminal activity, drugs purchased with taxpayers' own money to do an unlawful experiment, to bolster an argument to have crystal meth available in stores. Reading the report from mid-July is like reading a lunatic's manifesto. I cannot imagine a world in which anyone would think it's a good idea to start selling crystal meth on retail shelves.
What's notable is that in the report itself, she acknowledged that all of the research on the kind of drug legalization that she was advocating for was hypothetical, speculative, theoretical. So she was advocating for this radical experiment essentially with no evidence.
This is an evidence-based project and program that it meets the test of evidence and science.
When you read that report, one sees not the words of someone who was following evidence-based policymaking, but the words of a zealot who wants drug legalization regardless if there is evidence for it or not. I really can't stress enough how low quality the evidence base for safer supply is, and I'm gonna describe it like a ladder. So at the lowest rung, you have these qualitative studies that rely on semi-structured interviews with patients who are in safer supply programs.
Our mandate is to reform the system, and so we're encouraging you to give us feedback, right? Take the drugs if you want, try them. We've got a little feedback form. Bring it back to us. We'll give you a little stipend for your feedback. You get to choose. You get to be a participant.
These studies essentially just interview people who are on safer supply, ask them, is this program benefiting you? Are you selling your drugs? If yes, then why? And when these patients say, this is great, there's no downsides, of course I would never sell my drugs, or if I did, it's because of compassionate sharing, the harm reduction researchers framed this as being objective evidence of success.
An addicted person in recovery once told me, you can always tell when an addicted person is lying.
And the answer is they're moving their lips. So I don't mean that disparagingly, but they lie because they need to procure their drug like you and I need bread and water. So they will say anything to get that drug. And are these doctors who are prescribing these vast amounts of opioids so ignorant and so naive as to believe that the patient needs that amount of an opioid?
Listen, you can't listen to an addict if you're looking for the answers to drug addiction. You just can't, because while you're in an active addiction, as I said, you're always going to say, I want more, I want more, I want more. You're the addict going in. You're talking to a doctor, oh, you know, if I had 30 a day, I'd stop. But anyone who's walked the walk goes, and I got to assume, I don't know, maybe some people are naive, doctors are naive. I don't think so, man. You don't go through that much education being that naive.
You have a direct impact, a direct say on the drugs that are going into your body, on what you're allowed to consume. So this is a way to show the government that there are other ways to do this. There are better ways to do this.
It looks more like messaging designed to achieve a certain end, which are decriminalization and expanding the flow of pharmaceuticals.
Contrary to political talking points and government spin, safe supply, and specifically unwitnessed safe supply, is not evidence-based and is instead a radical social experiment that has never been seriously tried anywhere else in the world. And in BC, they continue to take it to new, even more unsettling extremes.
There were these protocols that were published in August of 2023 in BC. They were published very quietly that permitted the province-wide prescribing of safe fentanyl tablets and safe sufentanil. Sufentanil is a type of fentanyl.
You say fentanyl pills?
Yes.
Is it supervised or?
No.
British Columbia is now being criticized for having fentanyl on the menu of drugs available and for allowing minors to take part, seemingly without parental consent.
Now, there are a whole bunch of different problems here. One of the problems is that the protocols explicitly acknowledge the fact that there was no evidence supporting this intervention, that we don't have any evidence showing that it works or that it can be done safely. I think that this is grossly unethical because you're essentially experimenting on these drug users.
And so, you know, when we're dealing with something that essentially is an experiment, we should have even more caution into who potentially is influencing these programs, who is doing the research, and what is their motivation, and do they stand to profit from the policies that they're making?
There are growing concerns about a new threat in the toxic drug crisis. Joining us is Dr. Paxton Bach, co-medical director with the BC Centre on Substance Use.
The BC Centre on Substance Use. The BC Centre on Substance Use.
So the BC Centre for Substance Use, also known as the BCCSU, is one of the most influential research institutions in Canada when it comes to addiction policy making. When the BC provincial government wanted to create clinical guidelines for safer supply in 2020, they outsourced this to the BCCSU. So one cannot overstate the amount of influence that this organization has on addiction policymaking in BC and by extension in Canada as a whole. Now, that's a bit of a problem because the BCCSU does accept corporate money and isn't always transparent about what kind of money it receives and what the expectations of that funding can be.
There's no visibility at all on whether and how much money might be coming from the pharmaceutical industry to support those activities. And at a minimum, the public needs to have complete transparency into whether that's happening.
I tried to dig into the finances of the BCCSU, but getting information is very difficult. They didn't want to share any of their financial information. And when you look at its parent organization's financial statements, very little information is given about how money flows in the BCCSU itself. So there are a lot of question marks there about how money is being spent and where money is coming from.
They acknowledge some pharmaceutical funders on their website, but they don't say how much, and they don't say what the money is used for.
If groups like the BCCSU, which have played such an integral part in pushing the ideology of harm reduction in Canada, are also receiving massive donations from corporate entities, it raises obvious questions surrounding potential conflicts of interest. While much of their funding remains shrouded in mystery, we do know it includes generous contributions from the cannabis industry, pharmaceuticals, and, importantly, Shoppers Drug Mart, who, by collecting a dispense fee each time an addict fills their daily prescription, are one of the largest financial beneficiaries of the government's Safe Supply program. They also happen to gift the BCCSU $2 million. But are the BCCSU's apparent conflicts unique? Or are they part of a much larger and concerning trend? To find out, I met with Dr. Jenny Melamed, who has watched the addictions crisis evolve over her 20 years of practice.
What do you think is driving them? Is it ideology? Is it a belief that everyone has a right to kind of use drugs in their personal time? Are there concerning financial or business motivations that some of them might have?
I think different people have got different motivations. Okay, for some of them it is financial, without a doubt. Okay, some of the ex-people who were involved in policy now own heroin, fentanyl companies.
And 4 of the leading figures, all HIV/AIDS experts, formed companies related to pharmaceuticals. The former provincial health officer and the scientific director of our main health research funder collaborated to form a heroin company. The former deputy provincial health officer formed a company to dispense opioids in a kind of a vending machine type of setup. And the 4th formed another pharmaceutical company while he was directing the BC Centre on Substance Use. So there's a close group here, and an obviously close shared way of thinking, not only about how to respond to this crisis of poisoning deaths, but also, thinking longer term about the likelihood of reforms and possibly, further advances in policy changes that would make their corporate endeavors flourish.
Those most responsible for shaping BC's and Canada's radical approach to harm reduction have since appeared to cash in on the very same policies they've helped create. And when it comes to showering down money on this newly created harm reduction industry, there is no greater benefactor than the Liberal government in Ottawa, which has allocated hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars to support Safe Supply and other so-called harm reduction measures and activist groups through what are known as SUOP grants. I wanted to know where exactly these taxpayer dollars were going, so I met with Kala, a community activist who's been following the money in her hometown of Ottawa, just blocks from Parliament Hill.
Poverty is big business. All the funding models and everything, the people who, absolutely. Executive directors make hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. They pocket the money. So it's like we've got all these systems in place that get a very few people lots and lots of money while poverty and addiction run rampant.
There was a study done by the Ottawa Police Services that showed that there's $500 million of services coming into our downtown core of Ottawa. And as I sort of started looking under the hood, I would say that we have some concerns. I think that's fair to say, yeah. The Pathways to Recovery, Respect RX, Recovery Care sort of trifecta, I noticed them pop up on Rideau and Montreal Road. And I kind of didn't really understand, but people were telling me as I was going door to door about, I'm finding the Respect RX bottles in my child's backpack, or I heard about it at a party, or someone was being offered, or sometimes when I was speaking to street involved people, they were saying that was kind of a currency they were using, be able to score fentanyl.
While investigating the money behind Safe Supply in Ottawa, the names of 2 for-profit businesses repeatedly came up: Respect RX and Recovery Care, a chain of pharmacies and addiction clinics often located side by side and loosely connected with a nonprofit called Pathways to Recovery that received a $7 million SUOP grant from the federal government in 2020. But where did all this money go? And is there more to the story than first appears?
Just to explain, there's Pathways to Recovery, which is the nonprofit, which was started in 2020, which is getting the SUOP federal funding. It's $7 million in 2020. They have a for-profit clinic, and they also have a for-profit pharmacy called RespectRx and Recovery Care. And they share multiple duplication in leadership. So Donna Sarrazin is on the board of directors, and she's also the executive director, and she's also the CEO. Many of the doctors and pharmacists also sit on the various boards of directors, and that to me was a huge red flag. We don't know the salaries of the people working there. They just don't seem to have the same amount of scrutiny that other organizations have to go through, and I find that very interesting.
Is the money that's coming from the federal government to that overarching nonprofit, is any of that filtering down to those for-profit?
We don't know. We don't have any.
So we can't find out where that $7 million really went, other than the people are the same and all. There's much overlap in these organizations.
Correct. Yes, and that to me is concerning.
So right behind us, so that's.
Recovery Care is the Safe Supply Clinic, and right next door is RespectRx, which is their partner pharmacy.
You basically get your prescription for Safe Supply, 30 Dilaudid, whatever it is.
Whatever it is.
And then you walk next door, and then it's a daily fill.
Yeah.
The usual dispensing fee is $11.99. And then when you add in the millions of dollars coming from Health Canada under the SUOP, where is that money going?
There's one guy who owns 4 RespectRx's because they're all separate.
Oh, there's more of these. It's not
Oh,
so this is not a small little operation here.
No, there's a few of them.
Okay.
There's I think 6 or 7 RespectRx's, and wherever there's a RespectRx, you can pretty much find a Recovery Care.
Each clinic would be raking in more than $2 million a year at my modest and very conservative numbers. Mm-hmm. And then let's go to the pharmacy. If you're doing $11.99 dispensing fee, and the pharmacy's linked to the clinic, you're getting taxpayer. This is all, taxpayers are funding this travesty. Mm-hmm. There's no accountability, there's no transparency. If it's public money, why can't we see the reports?
Do you believe there's people getting rich off your son's addiction?
Yes.
The directors of Pathways to Recovery and people leading the Safer Supply Ottawa initiative are also the owners of RespectRx pharmacies and Recovery Care clinics. What it looks like is that business owners have set up a corporation, a not-for-profit corporation, in order to receive federal monies to fund their businesses. And that business is drugs, hydromorphone.
Handing out addictive opioids.
Yeah, handing out addictive opioids.
So how did we get here, and who's to blame? With more than 50,000 Canadians dead, these aren't rhetorical queries, but rather the public health questions of our time. And while the complex and varied motivations of those involved may never be truly known, some things can be said as a matter of fact. Evidence was ignored. Canadians were misled. And some have profited mightily off the suffering and despair of their fellow man. But the greatest indictment has to be reserved for those in our political class. It is ultimately they who must bear responsibility for the policies that have perpetuated so much misery and pain. For it is they who cheered and defended such policies right up until the very end.
Canada's Mental Health and Addictions Minister is responding to ongoing criticism about federal funding for safety supply programs. Yara Sachs says concerns about the approach are anchored in fear and stigma.
The current Minister of Addictions and Mental Health said those opposed to these safe supply programs are rooted in stigma and fear. That's all. That's where all the.
Well, she can come and talk to me, and I'll educate her. And if she has children, may this addiction curse not be visited on them. It's not rooted in stigma. It's called reality. It's a tragedy that's unfolding every single day on one of the nation's capital main streets. And, the Prime Minister and his addictions minister and whoever else that's in, they're in their little ivory tower blathering about stuff they don't even know.
Fentanyl is an absolute crisis in the United States. It's a challenge here, but it's a crisis there.
If we don't change the policy on this, and if we don't change the way that this works, we're going to create an entirely new epidemic. It'll become so out of control.
We know that anchoring ourselves in science and data, making sure that issues of harm reduction, safe consumption are put to the forefront. We will continue to be grounded in what works, in compassion, in evidence.
I mean, to me, it just seems like we're making it easier for people to get their next fix.
Oh yeah, it's a lot. Oh shit, man! Wow, man, it would have been a lot easier to stay high back in nowadays compared to my days. We had to work at it. We would drive from Ottawa to Montreal to go to a pharmacy to pick up 30 Perkinans.
Well, now you just have to walk down the street.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You know, and get something stronger, cheaper.
Mr. Speaker, we are pretty fed up with this fight against evidence-based programs that actually are saving lives. We cannot allow the Conservatives to take us back to the failed ideology of the past.
You know, when I hear ministers, like the federal minister and even the provincial minister, say things like, you know, the criticism is just stigma and fear, I think that they should go and spend an afternoon with a grieving family and find out that there is nothing more stigmatizing than having to live the rest of your life knowing that your child, they died because we have a government that refuses to acknowledge that poison is poison. Accuse me of raising stigma, but no one can honestly look around right now and say what they're doing is working.